Well, one of the stories that made headlines this week was the release of the last part of the state capture report. In that final installment, the Commission's chairperson, Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, found wrongdoing by many high-ranking government officials and business people. That's again been met with calls for the implicated to be prosecuted. Let's talk further about this with Sanusha Naidu, Senior Research Associate based at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Sanusha, always good to have you in Newzroom Afrika. So one of the things that the chairperson said when he handed over the report in that ceremony to the president was that the inquiry simply could not go through each and every allegation made. And I wonder where that then leaves South Africa as far as getting a full picture of what state capture was and what it did to the country.
Good evening, Tembekile, and good evening to the viewers. I think you're right. I mean, I think the intensity of the State Capture Commission and just the terms of reference in the context within which it had to deal with and investigate and kind of come up with a narrative of how state capture had taken place, who were the architects of state capture, and more importantly, the implications this had for the state as the question in terms of accountability, transparency, corruption, and so forth, I think just makes you realize the depth at which we are dealing with the tip of an iceberg. And for the Chief Justice to actually acknowledge that in the way that he had presented the final report to the President makes you realize that we're not just dealing with some kind of capture of state entities or owned entities. It is a very systematic approach to how this whole thing was planned, the kind of understanding of where you actually find the ways in which to put into place the architecture and the framework for capture, and of course then you go about implementing it. And the astonishing thing about this is how well they implemented it. Unfortunately, they did get caught, but it also tells you to what extent that the actors and the deep level nature of this goes beyond the terms of reference of what the Commission was investigating.
How then do we address what's been left untouched, either because the Commission did not have the time or resources, or because the issues themselves were beyond its scope? Because some in the ANC, depending on which faction you speak to, will say state capture predated the Zuma years and that state capture has continued post the Zuma presidency.
I think it's a very tough question you're asking. I don't have my crystal ball on this one. I think all of us have load shedding on our crystal balls right now. So to basically talk about these things in the way that you're wanting to understand how do we move forward from this is going to be a difficult one to try and create a framework around which we say, this is what we work with. And I think that's the starting point, is this is what we have. This is how we have to go forward. And I think the bigger challenge now is what is the process going forward after this, the Commission reports have been analyzed, assessed, and the President had noted when he received the final report that he'll have to go to Parliament, make the presentation, come up with the framework. Parliament has to then provide the legislative process going forward. And then, of course, there's the question of the criminal prosecuting nature of things. The problem here is how long will it take to just go in terms of the kinds of punitive action and the criminal process that has to accompany the recommendations made by the Commission in terms of taking those that have actually defrauded the state to court. And then, of course, you're raising a very valid point of whether it starts in the period in which the Commission's terms of reference was defined, or does it predate that? And more importantly, is it still continuing, and are we actually keeping our finger on the pulse of preventing it? We know what happened in COVID-19 of the PPE contracts. We can see that in terms of some of the issues that are coming to the fold in the context of looking at whether money was really spent to mitigate climate change, to improve infrastructure. We can see communities that are basically just broken, municipalities that are not functioning. So I think at the end of the day is, do we deal with what we have currently, but at the same time, is it a twin peak process where you try to mitigate the risk even further? Because right now, I think we're in a kind of 100-meter sprint of also what's going on in terms of some of the issues that need to be dealt with in government and outside of government.
Fair to say, then, that we may never know the full extent.
Well, I would basically want to hedge that bet with you and say, I'm going to play safe with the House and say, yes, we will probably never know. We probably have an idea and even a deep perception of how broad and percolated this corruption goes. But in terms of the legal evidence and in terms of getting the kinds of evidence you want, we even see how whistleblowers have had their lives threatened.
I mentioned the ANC earlier. You'll recall the constant refrain from the party whenever the name of a leader, be it the former President Jacob Zuma, the likes of Zizi Godwa, Gwede Mandashe, whenever their names would come up, the party would always say, well, this is not an inquiry where the ANC is on trial. But I wonder how much that still holds when you consider that as we sit here tonight, the ANC has a former president who's been seriously implicated. There's a recommendation from the commission that he be investigated for possible criminal prosecution. That's the former president Jacob Zuma. You've got a sitting president, Cyril Ramaphosa now, whom the commission says did not tell the truth when it came to what was being done with the recommendations from a panel that looked at strengthening the country's intelligence service. It also says, this commission, that Ramaphosa, who was deputy at the time, should or could have done more to stop the full extent of state capture as it unfolded. Then you've got the party's suspended Secretary General, Ace Magashule, who's also been implicated, and the commission says he should in fact be pursued for criminal investigation to do with the Frieda Dairy Farm scandal. So can the party still say that it was not on trial?
No. Emphatically no. I mean, you are the ruling party, so you can't actually then say, well, it's not us, it's government. You are actually the government in power in terms of the fact that you are leading in the country. So you can't necessarily close ranks on this issue and then assume that you could basically play these kinds of insulating games and try and, nip here and dabble there and try and, and fleet the issue and skirt the issues. Because at the end of the day, you are accountable. If you're not accountable to yourself, you are accountable to the electorate and the public of South Africa. And I think to a large extent to try and close ranks on this and say, well, this commission was not really about us, it's just a cop-out.
Could part of the response be in crafting new policy, new anti-corruption legislation?
Well, for me, Tembekele, I think we've got good frameworks around policy. I think the institutional architecture is vulnerable, weak, and at times broken. It's about carrying out those implementation of policy. I mean, you have the National Treasury in terms of setting very strict criteria on what kind of processes need to be conformed to when it comes to state tender. It's the Public Management or Financial Management Act. It's there for everyone to actually apply. But what happens is that it gets applied very rigorously and in an inflexible way at the bottom end of the value chain and the supply chain. But when it goes further up, those kinds of rules get thrown out of the window. There's no kind of accountability. So I think it's not about whether we recraft or reconfigure policy. Yes, there may be elements of the policy that needs to be recrafted in a way that makes it more punitive in terms of action. And of course, blacklisting and so forth of people, and even getting people who are in the higher echelons of power in government actually to be struck off from ever contesting an election and so forth. But I think the problem is the implementation of what we have, because this is where I think there's almost this blindsidedness to say, well, yeah, these regulations are there, but we can basically go after the small fish, but the big fish, it's fine. We all are going to basically make some money out of this.
Sanusha Naidu, always fantastic to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time tonight.
Pleasure, and have a great weekend.